Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We are delighted to welcome so many of you here, literally standing room only, to this President's Forum series, and we are very thrilled to host Professor Deneen here. Part of the effort here at a small residential liberal arts and sciences institution is to have the opportunity to model and engage in conversations, particularly in these times, and to talk across difference. And that has been certainly so much of the effort in the past couple of years in honor of our bicentennial. Last year, we were able to host former Governor Chris Christie and James Carville in conversation, or Frank Bruni from the New York Times and Lee Carter from Fox News, and various speakers to this campus over the years bringing their perspective and engaging with students and our faculty and our staff and our Geneva neighbors. So in that spirit, we warmly welcome all of you here. And let me begin by thanking our Department of Politics, and in particular our colleague, Professor Jody Dean, who had the very good idea to invite Professor Deneen. He told me earlier at dinner he would be a reader of her blog posts over the years. For those of you who know Professor Dean and her blog posts, you may find that of interest and confusion. But I think they share, as political theorists, an appreciation of ideas. And that is at the heart of a liberal arts and sciences education here at Hobart and William Smith, in our ability to talk across difference. Tonight, we're fortunate to have Professor of Political Science at Notre Dame University, Patrick Deneen, here as a political theorist. He is the author of 8 books, trained at Rutgers as an undergraduate in English literature, for all of you out there, and his doctoral work also at Rutgers, having taught at Princeton University and Georgetown University. He has been at Notre Dame. There's a few Notre Dame alums here in the room since 2012, right, or so. But I think for many of us, he came onto the screen in 2018 when he wrote a very important book that drew the attention of so many, Why Liberalism Fails. And it received accolades from a range of thinkers, from David Brooks to President Barack Obama, putting it on his read list of 2018. And so into that space and opportunity of thinking through liberalism and its failure from the perspective of Professor Deneen, he has engendered among so many conservative activists and elected officials quite a following in the ensuing years. Politico magazine notes of Professor Deneen: he has risen to prominence as a major intellectual on the new right, a loose group of conservative academics, activists, politicians that took shape in the years following Donald Trump's election. So we are very grateful to the Department of Politics, certainly, and to Professor Dean in particular, and to all of you for joining us. Join me in welcoming Professor Patrick Deneen.
Thank you so much, President Guerin. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you to Jody Dean, who, it is true, I was an avid reader of her blog back in the day that there were such things as blogs, and found about, 80% of things that I agreed with, which makes the other 20% even more interesting. So I'm deeply grateful to be with you here. This is, even though the weather is much like our weather in South Bend, Indiana today, it nevertheless is a stunningly beautiful part of the country that I've only been to once or twice, and so I'm very happy to be here. And I'm impressed at this turnout. It's certainly not due to me, but obviously something very special in this community. So again, thank you for the invitation. When Jody invited me to come and speak as a kind of somewhat unrepresentative view that is generally in circulation on college campuses today, she asked me for possible titles, and one title that I suggested would be, "Is there a conservative tradition in America?" And she said, "That's the one." So that's my assignment for today. And I'm tempted simply to say the answer is no, and let's go have refreshments. That's the sum of it. But let me actually try to explain why I think it's at least a qualified maybe, but not a resounding yes. So obviously I want to begin then with a somewhat counterintuitive, probably, and maybe peculiar way to approach my assigned topic of whether there's a conservative tradition in America, because I suspect that many of you, whether you're on the left or the right, would answer that question strongly in the affirmative. And I think the more on the left you are, the more you're likely to answer that question very strongly on the affirmative, since that's kind of the foreboding enemy that's been in one's view for so many years. And then, of course, one would immediately launch into a denunciation of the perverse and pervasive and malignant form of conservatism that is on the scene, especially today, and then immediately start talking about Donald Trump. So that would be the usual plan of attack. But as someone who considers himself to be a conservative, although a peculiar conservative, I want to begin with a certain amount of skepticism toward this question of whether there's a conservative tradition in America. And in order to arrive at this, or at least explain this skeptical position, I want to actually begin by invoking an authority of a very significant figure on the left, at least in the intellectual tradition of America, who had, in a sense, assigned himself the following question: whether there was a socialist tradition in America, and wrote an entire book in some ways to answer the question with similar skepticism, that there was not a socialist tradition in America, and for one very specific reason. The author and intellectual that I'm referring to is named Louis Hartz. He was a political scientist, political theorist, historian at Harvard University in the government department, and who wrote a book in 1955 called The Liberal Tradition in America, and which remains, I think, even to this day, among the few books of its era that is still read today by contemporary students who seek insight into the nature of the American tradition. It would be a dream of mine if somebody were reading this book, Why Liberalism Failed, some 75 or 80 years after it had been written. That's a pretty decent shelf life for any book, and certainly one of several scores. Hartz was a man of the left. Indeed, he was a socialist. And his book was written in an effort to explain why it was that America, in particular in contrast to Europe, had never developed a powerful or successful or sustained socialist party and movement. His argument, in a nutshell, was that America was distinct from other European nations, not because of material conditions — there were still capitalists here and there was still a working class here — but because of ideology. So it wasn't the material conditions which Marx says would give rise to a working class movement. It was rather ideology. And the American ideology was one that had arisen in part and in many ways because it lacked a feudal past. There was never a feudal tradition on the American continent, at least under its European dominion. Here's what Hartz had to say. I'm going to quote from him for a moment, so I'll use my air quotes. Quote, "Marx went wrong in his historical analysis, attributing as he did the emergence of the socialist ideology to the objective movement of economic forces. Actually, socialism is largely an ideological phenomenon, so not one arising primarily from material conditions," he's saying, "arising out of the principle of class and the revolutionary liberal, in this sense, liberatory revolt against them, which the old European order inspired." So to translate, what he's saying is that a feudalist past based upon an aristocratic overlords and a feudal or peasant class gives rise to the kind of, you could say, is the fuel of a kind of revolutionary liberal revolt. It is not accidental, then, that America, which has uniquely lacked a feudal tradition, has also uniquely lacked a socialist tradition. The Ancien regime goes on to inspire Rousseau and then to inspire Marx. In America, by contrast, a society that begins with Locke, John Locke, and thus transforms him, stays with Locke, by virtue of an absolute and irrational attachment it develops for him, and becomes as indifferent to the challenge of socialism in the later era as it was unfamiliar with the heritage of feudalism in the earlier one. That's his explanation in kind of the summary form. Since there was no feudalism here, never a king, never a series of lords and earls and barons, and never a peasant class, when Tocqueville comes to America in the 1830s, he remarks, this is a remarkable country. Everything here is defined by equality of conditions. It's not saying everyone's equal, but no one has a higher status by dint of their birth. And he says that lacking this feudal past, it therefore lacked the kind of fuel for a socialist revolutionary tradition. So since America didn't have that class system, it lacked the kind of movement that sought the overthrow of the ancien regime. And nor did it foster the kind of counter-revolutionary movement that formed the basis of the modern and self-conscious form of conservatism. In other words, conservatism, aristocratic society didn't necessarily call itself conservative. It's really post-revolutionary period in which you get the rise of a self-conscious ism that considers itself to be conservative, that's attempting to reinstate the conditions that once applied. So Edmund Burke, the first conservative, is writing in the wake of the French Revolution, proposing that this was a wrong path. So in short then, Hart's claim that America was a nation that had consistently proven immune to both the attractions of Karl Marx and Edmund Burke because of the preeminence of the founding philosophy of John Locke, who influenced our founding fathers. I hope you read Locke on this campus, political theory, right? Yeah. So you recognize that John Locke, Thomas Jefferson was basically committing plagiarism when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. It's a lot of phrases from John Locke's second treatise in the Declaration. Often, if you can go to Wikipedia, I'm not recommending it, and you will see under John Locke, it will say sometimes considered to be America's philosopher, so the founding of the liberal tradition. So America, according to Hartz, was neither revolutionary in its nature, nor traditionalist because it was liberal. And hence there's a certain irony to Hartz's book. A book called The Liberal Tradition in America points to a kind of anti-tradition, one that effectively crowded out both a more radical and revolutionary anti-traditionalism of Marx and company, while also precluding any attraction to the traditionalist defense of the ancien regime. There was never one that was here. What America instead produced, much to the lamentation of Hartz, was a centrist liberal ideology, one that was celebrated at the time that he was writing this book. Some of you might be familiar with the phrase consensus, the liberal consensus. In the post-World War II period, during the Cold War, kind of the thing that many people fantasize about today. If only our politics could go back to a time when everything wasn't so divided politically, and senators could go out to the Monocle bar, and they could broker deals, and they didn't hate each other because they were in different parties. Well, that was consensus liberalism, dating back to the post-World War II period. Hartz wrote this book with a kind of pessimistic resignation, a kind of the voice of a disappointed Marxist. And me, as a disappointed and disillusioned conservative, actually travel a fair distance together, Hartz and I. While most contemporary academic commentators who are critical of conservatism, which is to say most academics being on the left, are critics of conservatism, they assume that conservatism is basically this kind of monolithic entity that has prevented the development of socialism. But most fail to recognize or to acknowledge Hartz's perceptive point. What they are criticizing, what they on the left are criticizing, is not conservatism, but Lockeanism. They're criticizing liberalism. They're Hartzian socialists without Hartz's insight. Right? That what they're criticizing, in fact, is classical liberalism, Lockean liberalism. Like Hartz, today's left academics largely abhor the basic features of our economic system, capitalism, the one that arose wedded to the hip with liberal political ideology, and especially its unceasing generation of inequality, a system that historically has always favored capital over workers, owners over the working class, and one that reduces all human relations to a kind of market calculation, what Marx calls the cash nexus, a kind of reduction to everything to utilitarian purposes and utilitarian ends. Left critics dislike the system's generation of individualism, its emphasis upon self-interest, its materialism, its crassness, calling people, reducing them to being consumers rather than citizens, its insistence upon the inviolability of individual rights of property, its hostility toward taxation at the expense of social and communal goods, of health, education, housing, welfare, and so on. Unlike Hart's, today's left critics generally describe these practices and beliefs as conservative, while Hart's recognized, in fact, that these are the positions of liberalism, a liberalism that, according to him, acted as a kind of prophylactic against the development of a more socialist political order. Indeed, I'm going to suggest, it's not Hart's argument, but Hart's in some ways implicitly laments that there is no actual conservative tradition in America, because if there had been, at least there would be the prospect of a socialist reaction. He doesn't say that out loud, but it's kind of implicit in his argument. Now, the main reason why most, let's say, left critics and even socialists today charge conservatism, as they call it, with the various sins of America, owes considerable debt to the successful relabeling of liberalism as conservatism. It's not without cause that they call it conservative. Most of what goes by the name of conservative today is the result of fairly studious and even titanic efforts of philosophers and activists and journalists and popularizers and shock jock radio hosts and so forth to label what Hart's had called, and rightly called, Lockean liberalism instead as a philosophy and a political order that was henceforth to be known as conservative. And correspondingly, what was known as liberalism, at least in the United States, came to be thought of as that which was on the left side of the political scale, the left liberal part of the political spectrum, including the tradition of FDR, LBJ, and the Democratic Party since the 1960s. Now, to some degree, this labeling can be attributed to the very same grounds that Hart's wrote his book, which was a dissatisfaction not of a socialist, but a dissatisfaction of liberals, classical liberals, Lockean liberals, who believed that American liberalism had been, in a way, captured by the left. Consensus liberalism was simply too far to the left, having been captured by what they viewed as socialist dimensions, FDR, the New Deal, LBJ. Various figures in the Lockean tradition believed that American liberalism had simply moved too far to the left and sought to distinguish themselves from the consensus liberalism of the post-World War II period. Here you can think of the efforts of William F. Buckley, the creation of National Review, the creation of fusionism, those of you who are interested in this history of conservatism, Frank Buckley, the effort to sort of shape a kind of conservatism out of disparate elements of American politics that were sort of, not necessarily in agreement, other than their opposition to various forms of leftism. And so in contrast to those calling itself conservative. Moreover, their appeal to conservatism was in the name of the fact that they viewed the Lockean tradition as the original founding true tradition of America. And hence they were trying to conserve something. They were trying to conserve the liberal tradition. Right, what Hart said was the American tradition. And notice how often we hear this. If you track or if you pay attention to the conservative world, as I certainly do, I'm deep, knee-deep or hip-deep in it, there's an unceasing appeal to the American founding. Right? You can't prove you're conservative bona fides unless you talk about the American founding in your sleep. There's the constant invocation, as if like totem or biblical verses of the Declaration and the Constitution. And of course, the efforts, the kind of unstinting efforts to work out the original understanding of the Constitution. And why is this? Well, that's the true nature of America. Right? What the founders and those who ratified the Constitution thought the Constitution meant is what should be our governing philosophy. And if we can get pure, true knowledge of the founding understanding, then we will know what America really is. This is then what's called the conservative tradition. Now, the fact that in a lot of ways what's called conservatism is in fact really a form of liberalism has been acknowledged by not a small number of so-called conservatives. Conservatives who are worried about any potential misidentification of what they're actually for. I'll give you two prime examples of this. Two of the architects of the kind of renewal of Lockean liberalism in the post-World War II period are Friedrich Hayek, who writes a famous, very influential book called The Road to Serfdom, among many other books, and Milton Friedman, The Freedom to Choose, right? Architect of free market ideology. Both of them wrote an essay entitled Why I Am Not a Conservative, or I Am Not a Conservative. They wanted for their readers to know that they were not conservative in that feudal sense, in that European sense. They were conservative in the sense they wanted to conserve Lockeanism. They wanted to conserve liberalism. There's another interesting moment in the late 80s when one of the main figures in the Claremont Institute, another major conservative organization, gave a lecture at another major conservative institution, the American Enterprise Institute, in which he went after Russell Kirk. Charles Kessler, who's the editor of the Claremont Review, a very central figure in the conservative movement. And he went after Russell Kirk, many of whom view as one of the architects of modern or contemporary conservatism, because he viewed Russell Kirk as having attempted to create or craft or bring into existence a kind of feudal idea of conservatism. If you know anything of Russell Kirk and his book, his very important book, The Conservative Mind, some people say there is no such thing. Russell Kirk relied heavily on British authors in that book to craft his sort of curated version of what conservatism was. And in that lecture, in that speech that Kessler gave, not a few times Kessler says this is a fundamentally un-American form of conservatism. Okay, so that lays out at least some of the basic premises why I'm at least skeptical that there is no conservative, or at least not terribly conservative tradition in America, because I tend to agree with Hartz and I tend to agree with Hayek and Friedman. But at the same time, I want to qualify that, because Hartz was himself a bit too categorical in his conclusion, born of his pessimism, his political pessimism at that moment. He's a disappointed socialist, and he's a disappointed socialist because socialism had made gains in only just the several previous decades, in the 1930s, among other times. You had candidates who were self-declared socialists who were running and running well for the president. Right? You had a socialist party that was gaining strength in the United States. And in many ways, it might have been more successful but for the intervention of World War II and then the kind of rise of the liberal consensus into the middle and latter part of the 20th century. So his disappointment is, in some ways, arises from the fact that he sees a sort of ineffective socialism. But it's not that it didn't exist. His book was written in the wake of a decline of what had been potentially a powerful form of American socialism, which had shown legs only a few decades before, but which had faded by 1955. And so just as it's the case that there was, or just as it was not the case that there was not a socialist, too many negatives here. Just as it was the case that there was, in fact, a socialist tradition, if not overwhelming and powerful in the American tradition, so too it is a case that there has been, at least occasionally, a kind of conservative tradition in the form that might be recognizable to Hartz, but that has similarly waned. Now, it has a particularly New World form. It's not the feudal form. But it has been, in fact, as I want to suggest in parts of my talk tonight, it has been at various points in American history influential. What both, it seems to me, have in common, both the kind of a fairly occasional, momentary expressions of socialism in America on the margins, and momentary expressions of conservatism at the margins, is in some ways, it's what I want to adopt a phrase from the political theorist Sheldon Wolin. Sheldon Wolin, who taught for many years at Berkeley, was my teacher's teacher, man of the left, both him and my teacher, and then taught at Princeton for many years. And Professor Dean apparently did not take a course with him as an undergraduate, for shame. Sheldon Wolin, as a disappointed Democrat, small d Democrat, democratic theorist, toward the end of his life concluded that true democracy was only fugitive, occasional, would occasionally appear. True democracy in the participatory form, in an active form, only occasionally emerged and then would fade away under the dominance of the liberal tradition. Well, perhaps what we're facing then is the kind of reality of a kind of fugitive socialism in Hartz's view, and a fugitive conservatism in my view. Start the slides. Oh, I don't have the clicker. Do you have the clicker? Okay, sorry. As I've been thinking about this, I've been thinking in particular about the nature of what this conservatism and socialist traditions both confront in the American setting, and why they have been in relatively a weakened condition, why they've been fugitive in the American tradition. And I want to posit as a kind of thesis that what makes socialism, in Hartz's estimation, Hartz's hopes, and conservatism in the way in which I want to talk about it, so I guess I should give you a little more notice. Conservatism, as I wish to describe it, both of them are extensively rely upon a form of populism. Kind of popular political expression. The role of a kind of every man, every woman, ordinary people, working class people, to be relatively in control of their political lives and their political order. But what the liberal tradition that Hartz describes has predominantly produced is a system in which the populace is always firmly under control. So, hit the slideshow. Thanks, you just put it down. Okay, that's all right. So, as I was thinking about this in recent years, every political scientist at some point in their lives is required to create a 4-part box, a 4-quadrant box. It's a requirement which I didn't fulfill in graduate school, and so I've decided late in life to produce to produce a 4-quadrant box. And a 4-quadrant box is kind of useful because it lets us look at sort of 2 dichotomies together. And as I was thinking about the interesting contrast between what Hartz describes as the liberal tradition in America, which has its left and right expression, what we think about as the kind of traditional Democratic and the traditional Republican Party, and the socialist and Marxist tradition, as opposed to the conservative tradition, is that in each case you have a kind of view toward the people, the masses, the many, in which either you conclude that the many have a tendency to be revolutionary or a tendency to be conservative. That's one point of division. So one way of viewing the masses is to say the masses are likely to have pitchforks and torches and be the rabble. And you either view that as a good thing or a bad thing. And it turns out if you're a Lockean liberal, you view that as a bad thing. And if you're a Marxist, you kind of view that as a good thing. You want the people to be sort of activated politically. But then there's another way of viewing the people as conservative, as stuck in the mud, as what Marx calls the lumpenproletariat, right? The people who just are sort of ignorant, or backward, or, more positive formulation, traditional. Prize order and stability. And then one's response to either of these perceptions is to say, well, viewing the people in this light, we would prefer, our view would be to prefer either that the people rule, people predominate, or that they don't, that we limit their rule, in particular by promoting a kind of elite, a certain kind of elite that limits the role of the people in society. And once you begin to sort of divide this out, it creates a kind of, or it generates a four-part box that I want to suggest. It might be helpful or illustrative. So here I've put up the two axes here, viewing the people as a kind of revolutionary force, particularly as regards property. Particularly as regards property. What is the view of the many toward property, or toward the rule of law? Right? Conservatives love the rule of law because the rule of law often is the thing that prevents the rabble from taking our property. Taxation, among other things. Right? Or to those who view the people as conservative. And it turns out that the upper row, those who prefer the elite rule, as I would want to describe that, in large part, I think, describes or captures kind of a deep motivation and understanding of the liberal tradition that Hartz is critical of. That the liberal tradition, among other things, produces a kind of ruling class that lines up on the right, what we think of as conservatives, as viewing the people as revolutionary, fearing the people as revolutionary, and needing, therefore, to have a certain kind of elite rule. And those of you who've had to read, I don't know if you assigned the Federalist Papers here, but the Federalist Papers, all you have to do is read the Federalist Papers to see and understand that this is a significant part what the Federalist Papers is about. You don't have to be Charles Beard, a good socialist historian, to understand that what the Federalists were attempting to do, what our founding fathers were attempting to do, was to have some amount of popular participation in politics, but to limit it, and especially to create institutions that would allow for the generation, especially of a ruling class, that would limit the revolutionary tendencies of the many. Right? There's a famous passage in Federalist 10 where Madison writes that, in the first instance, he writes that the first object of government is the preservation of property. The first object of government is the preservation of property. And that the way in which one will preserve property is by generating a kind of form of representation, so the people you're asked to vote for, that will ensure that it will select fit characters who will arrive at the public good through a kind of discernment that doesn't require the actual gathering of the many. They will filter the views of the many. They won't represent the views of the many. They will filter the views of the many. Representation is a kind of filtering. So in this first category that I would suggest that here we see some of the basic principles of classical liberalism, and its figure that lies behind this is John Locke. And elites here are, in a way, seek to preserve a kind of, especially material form of progress or economic progress. So someone like a Friedrich Hayek or Milton Friedman will extol the benefits of an open and free market in which property rights are preserved precisely by limiting the ability of the many to express their discontents, by slowing the advance of the economy. The need to limit the revolutionary tendency of the many. Now, opposing them within the liberal scheme is an argument for elite rule that especially stresses a concern that the people are conservative. Right? The people might cling to their guns and Bibles and even be deplorable. Right? This is a view of the many that tends toward those people who are backwards and toward which we have to have a kind of mistrust. And really, in many ways you could say that if the classical liberal tradition encourages, that we were talking about this over dinner, encourages especially and embraces the idea of meritocracy. It's one of the big hobby horses right now. One big reason of opposition to DEI is that it's seeking to forestall or short-circuit meritocracy, genuine merit. Every time some accident happens, a wheel falls off or a wall comes off an airplane, it's because of DEI. And if you don't think it's true, you can go look on X. I saw it, I read it there, it must be true. Right. What What the Lockean system seeks to advance is a society in which those with natural talent will emerge, and those natural talents won't be hampered by people's egalitarian impulses. Well, progressive liberalism tends in the direction of technocracy. It was, after all, the progressives who invent the first or created and advanced the first bureaucracy in our country. And why? Well, we don't want everyday people governing the country. We want experts. Right? We want experts who are knowledgeable about their particular area, not just because they helped out the presidential candidate, which is the way that people used to get appointed to office. Ever read a biography of Lincoln? It's amazing to read about all of the people that would line up outside the White House wanting a job because they had helped Lincoln win election. And Lincoln would sit in a room and people would file it, and he'd say, okay, you'll get a job as a postmaster here, and you'll get a job, dog catcher over there. That was a big job of the president, was doling out jobs. Well, the progressives come in and they say, we can't have a progressive society if we rely on the everyday people to govern us. Why? Because they're just not that knowledgeable. They're backward. And in fact, they're probably conservative. And this is where J.S. Mill's argument comes into play, because J.S. Mill argues in his book On Liberty, John Stuart Mill, the two Johns of liberalism, not in the illicit sense. John Stuart Mill argues on liberty that the main reason for liberty is to overcome the despotism of custom. That's it, those are his words. The despotism of custom prevents the advance of knowledge and progress. In fact, the book should be called On Progress, because liberty is merely a means. It's a means to progress. We need liberty in order to release us from the despotism of tradition and custom. This is why on page 1 of the book On Liberty, John Stuart Mill argues, well, for backward countries, he is, after all, in charge of a unit of the East India Trading Company in England. He says, in backward countries, despotism is justified in order to put them on the path of progress. So liberty is good when you're sort of advanced enough and you can overcome the despotism of custom. But if your custom is so deep and entrenched, well, then you just need despotism to overcome that despotism. Right? Liberty is a means. It's not the end. And so progressive liberalism really moves in the direction of a kind of mistrust of the many as backward, and a kind of promotion especially of expertise. Whenever you hear the words follow the science or trust the experts, you can hear the little John Stuart Mill in that voice. What are the responses to this on each side of the political spectrum? Well, we have, of course, on the other side of classical liberalism, and who hates Locke more than Karl Marx? Right? I mean, I can't think of a more opposite. Right? The defender of private property, to its utmost degree. Well, who is its great critic? Karl Marx. Right? Once we eliminate private property and all of the various forms of privatism, we will achieve a kind of utopia. And in order to achieve that, we need the many to overthrow the few. Right? The problem, the threat of our civilization is the dominance of the owners of society, the elites. And in order to overthrow them, we need the rabble to rise up. We need a dictatorship of the proletariat. We need the many to assume control. And once they assume control, then all contradictions will be resolved, and we will have the cessation of injustice in the world. So here you have, in a sense, the opposite. The people are revolutionary, and it's a good thing. And we seek for them to rise up. Well, lastly, and this is going to be maybe a surprise to you, this would be my view, but I'm not alone in this, in suggesting that a kind of genuine conservatism is also populist. But in this case, it's populism from the viewpoint that the people are not revolutionary in their nature, they're conservative. They're conservative in their nature. Now, that doesn't mean they want to be treated unjustly. Doesn't mean they want to be abused. In fact, it's often because they're conservative they don't want to be treated unjustly and don't want to be abused. Being untreated unjustly and being abused means that often your way of life is being unsettled. Or worse, you're being treated deeply unjustly. But it is a mistrust and a suspicion toward the toward the elites, and particularly the elites on the above, the progressives. Right, who want to set society in a progressive direction. But notice that there's a kind of, among conservatives, there's kind of a critique of both sides of liberalism. is really what I want to stress. And even in some ways, at least in some versions of Marxism or socialism, I would say more so, there's a critique of both sides of liberalism as well. But it's the conservative side that I really want to talk a little bit more about tonight. So let me bring this to my final part, in which I want to, we can shut this down now. I've run through my, sorry for the young people here who rely on social media stimulation. But that's it for tonight. Back to words. So here I want to suggest that if we understand conservatism in this, again, very schematic way in which I've described, there have been moments of kind of episodic or fugitive conservatism in America. And it's been of the populist variety. And in fact, and here I'm a little bit nervous because I know one of your professors here is a scholar of populism, so I'm a little bit nervous. But I want to suggest tonight, in fact, many of the populist moments that are often understood to be left movements, looked at from one perspective are left movements, but looked at from another perspective are conservative. And it's often difficult to distinguish these two things. But I want to suggest that there's a kind of continuity between a certain kind of left populism and a certain kind of right populism that might be considered to be a kind of populism. So let me give you at least 3 examples of this, and these are going to be I'm just going to be a drive-by, but I'm happy to talk about these. Anti-technology. Talk about these at more length during Q&A. So the first I would point to, and I think I put it up there on the slide, were the so-called anti-federalists. And these are the people who lost the debate over the Constitution. I was a student of Wilson Carey McWilliams, who was definitely a partisan of the anti-federalists among the few in higher education. So I had a deep dive into the anti-federalists as a graduate student. And like McWilliams, concluded that in many ways they had the better part of the argument, even if they didn't win. All right, so these were the people who were opposing the Constitution, not simply because they were against it, but they had an alternative view of what the American Republic could and ought to be. In his great 7-volume edition of the Complete Anti-Federalist, the scholar Herbert Storing began his introductory essay by saying that the Anti-Federalists were the conservatives. It's an interesting claim. And he designates them as the conservatives mainly because they wanted to preserve the system that was in existence, what was called the Articles of Confederation, and a confederal system in which the states were kind of sovereign. The states, they weren't entirely sovereign, but they had a lot more sovereignty than they currently do today. And they desired the preservation of this relatively more local form of government for reasons that we might be able to begin to discern would be conservative in that not feudal sense, but in a kind of traditional sense, a kind of traditional conservative sense. In the first case, they objected to the vision of someone like Alexander Hamilton that America would become predominantly a commercial and great military power, right? What we are today. Right? If those of you who go to the Broadway show Hamilton, you go because you're celebrating that Hamilton was right. Hamilton's vision was successful, and we're all beneficiaries of it. A powerful nation, a commercially successful nation, a prosperous and powerful nation. Well, this worried the Anti-Federalists, and it worried them for reasons that we probably at least can recognize today. Even back then, in the 1787, 1788, during the ratification debates, they worried it would lead to a society of materialism, in which our civic lives would be subsumed by consumptive lives, in which our ability to act as self-ruling citizens would be overwhelmed by our desire to buy things, to consume things, and indeed to become highly private in how we view our lives and leave the political sphere to others. They were concerned about the rise of avarice as the predominant way in which we would express our desires, and even often one reads in their words a concern about a society that would be consumed by luxury. It used to be a bad word. Now it's a good word. If you can put the word luxury in a commercial, that's good. Well, they viewed luxury as bad. Right? It meant you were too addicted to stuff, and stuff for the sake of showing it off. Right? Walking around Notre Dame's campus, I don't know if it's true here, it's not cold enough a day, I can't walk past 3 students without seeing a Canada Goose coat, which as far as I know, they cost about $1,000 a pop. That's a lot of money in my classrooms just to keep yourself warm in South Bend. That's luxury, and I don't mean that in a good way. They were concerned about the size of America, scale, something we don't talk about a lot anymore. But at the time of the American founding, there was a vibrant debate over what was the appropriate scale in which we would govern ourselves. If we become too large, can we really be said to be democratic? And I hear a lot of people, a lot of my friends, a lot of my colleagues, and a lot of my not friends who are my colleagues, talking about the threat to democracy. According to the Anti-Federalists, we are not a democracy. We're an oligarchy. We're a society run by a small set of elite, but we're not a democracy. Right? To denounce and worry about the state of democracy today, that should have happened decades ago. But what didn't happen on January 6th? I mean, I'm not condoning it, but I'm also not saying that was the moment that democracy was under threat. Because according to Aristotle, if we do Aristotle's reckoning, we're not a democracy. This is a plutocracy. They feared that a large republic would separate the people from their governors, their rulers. It would create an elite class. In one of the great debates that took place at the time of the American founding, here in the great state of New York, and I'm not saying this just because I'm here, this is really one of the great debates. Alexander Hamilton, representing the constitutional position, debated someone that most of you have never heard of, Melancton Smith. Melancton Smith, what a name, right? I understand there's a Smith College. I don't know if he's related. But Melancton Smith and Hamilton have this great debate that takes place over several days over the size of the House of Representatives. Who could imagine this? And Melancton Smith takes the case that you should have a very large House. You should have many representatives and very small districts. And why is this? He says, well, otherwise, these representatives are going to represent such a vast and large number of people that they'll be separate from us. We won't know them and they won't know us. The smaller the district, the more we will be ruled in the people's house by people drawn from the body of ordinary people. The more likely that a shopkeeper will get elected as opposed to, a reality TV star or something like that. Melancton Smith makes this argument in those debates, in the New York State debates. He says, those in middling circumstances, he's praising those in middling, so we would say today the middle class, those in middling circumstances have less temptation. They are inclined by habit and the company of those with whom they associate to set bounds to their passions and appetites. Okay, so he's saying they're more virtuous. But he says, if that doesn't suffice, they also want the means to gratify them. They're just poorer. Maybe they are as tempted as wealthy people. They don't have as much ability to do so. And thus they're obliged to employ their time in their respective calling. This is the working class. Hence the yeomanry of the country are more temperate, of better morals, and of less ambition than the great. The Anti-Federalists were worried about the creation of a standing army, the creation of a military empire, foreign adventurism, the desire to impose America's will on the world. And this is the reason for the Second Amendment. And the only reason for the Second Amendment in its original form. It wasn't that I could pack, an AK-47 when I'm walking to school. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Notice the first part of that clause, a well-regulated militia. And why did they want a well-regulated militia in which people had their own guns? So that you wouldn't have a professional army. Because when you have a professional army, they are now suddenly your employees and the government can send them wherever they want. But if it's us, it's going to be a lot harder to send us wherever they want. And it was of interest to me that in the lead up to the war in Iraq, which some conservatives opposed and some liberals, the journal American Conservative, which I serve on the board, on the advisory board for, was in strong opposition to the war in Iraq. So it wasn't all conservatives were of the view that we should invade. Charles Rangel, representative from the city of New York. It's a very New York heavy lecture tonight. Charles Rangel proposed that there should be the reinstitution of the draft before we went to war with Iraq. Now, it was a cynical proposal to some extent, although he had served, but he proposed it because he knew that if there was a draft, it would be impossible to pass a resolution to go to war in Iraq. the people wouldn't want it. As long as you have a professional army, it was easy. Okay, secondly, here I'm in real trouble, but I want to invoke another New Yorker, Christopher Lasch, who taught for many years at the University of Rochester, where I just landed today, and I'll take off from tomorrow, getting out of town as fast as I can. Emphasized that populism was a long-standing political tradition in America, which he believed was distinct from liberalism. Its stress, like that of Melanchthon Smith, was upon, as he put it, producerism, middling interests, and a substantial yeomanry. Those are all terms from Christopher Lasch, but those are also terms found in Melanchthon Smith. According to Lasch, the American populist tradition was, and I'm quoting, anti-capitalist, but not socialist or social democratic, at once radical and even revolutionary, and deeply conservative. All of these things together. Depending on what angle you look at, this populist tradition could look left socialist or right traditionalist. Its opposition against capitalism wasn't only because of its inequality, but also because capitalism was kind of disordered and led to instability in the lives of those who led traditional lives. It was a threat to the independence and proprietorship of the small yeoman. There was a preference for continuity, order, an insistence on the central importance of crafts, and the ability of guilds to govern themselves and not, in a sense, be subject to a boss. According to one source cited by Lasch, the most potentially revolutionary claims of that time, 19th century, were those which demanded that industrial capitalism be resisted in order to protect craft communities and traditional values. Now, is that left or is that right? It's pretty conservative. Here's Lasch again. The conventional identification of democracy with progress makes it hard to see that democratic movements in the 19th century took shape in opposition to innovation, in opposition to progress. Working class radicals, on the other hand, struggled to preserve a way of life that was under attack. They evinced a curious mixture of militancy and conservatism. Here's the irony then that's stressed by Lasch's analysis, that the American tradition of populism, which has consistently flared up and consistently lost, was a kind of indistinguishable mix of radical that from one angle could look socialist and another angle that could look conservative. Let me give one last concluding quote from Lasch's book. This I'm quoting from his book, The True and Only Heaven, published in 1991. Very much worth a read, although it's about 900 pages long. Here's where he concludes this chapter on populism. A whole way of life was at stake in the struggle against industrialism. Workers were defending not only their economic interests, but their crafts, families, and neighborhoods. The recognition that economic interests are not enough to inspire radical or revolutionary agitation or make people accept its risks suggests a more sweeping conclusion. So he's agreeing with Hartz here. It's not just revolutionary ideology that will get the working class moving. Rather, he says, resistance to innovation, it appears, is an important and perhaps indispensable ingredient in revolutionary action, along with a tendency to identify innovation with the disruption of older communities by invasive forces from outside. As Lasch describes the unfolding tragedy of the continuous defeat of populism in America, he notes over and over again that it was liberalism on both the left and the right that would simultaneously attack this tradition and its political form. From the left, suspicion against parochialism, backwardness, localism, suspicion of outsiders, was enough to condemn it to the dustbin of history. While on the right, in more recent years, populism has been embraced, especially for its electoral advantages. And Lasch, toward the end of his book, writes about the embrace of populism, especially among conservatives from the 60s on. Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, obviously Donald Trump. One which in many ways benefited from the disillusionment from this left I've just been describing, that regards people in this situation as backwards, tends to view them through a condescending lens, but which ultimately folded this populist energy into a primary agenda of a neoliberal economic orthodoxy that subverted the very aims and ends that Populist had voted for, hence led to the writing of a book called What's the Matter with Kansas? Why do these people keep voting against their economic interests? Okay. I have a third example I would give, but I think I'm probably running up against the hour. I don't want to hold you here. But I'll just mention it, and then we can talk about it if you'd like to during Q&A. And the third example is one of my favorite authors, again, someone who is curiously at the intersection of left and right. And this is the agrarian author Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry is a novelist and an essayist, short story writer, poet, who lives in the state of Kentucky in a small farm that he purchased after having an academic job in New York City. He did the inconceivable. He left New York City, a good academic job at NYU, to move to a farm that he plows with a horse and a plow. Wendell Berry spent his life arguing for the preservation of local places, and he's viewed, and rightly viewed, as one of the great voices in defense of what we today call environmentalism, but hardly had a name at the time he began writing. Defense of kind of integrity of nature and the need of human beings to live in a kind of concord with nature. From a certain angle, then, Wendell Berry looks like someone on the left. He's a constant, frequent critic of corporations, of institutions that essentially treat local places as raw materials, whether in the form of coal or copper, but maybe above all, as human beings, as human material. One of his greatest critiques has been the way that, especially that universities, like all three of the ones that were mentioned that I've taught at, Princeton, Georgetown, and Notre Dame, scoop up talented people from every part of the country, vacuum them up, strip mine them, process them, and then send them off to New York City to work for McKinsey. And what do we leave in their wake? Same thing as strip mining. Desiccated places, shorn of all of their talent, all of their human material. Berry has argued then for the preeminence of a kind of sense of being rooted. And only if we are rooted and care for our places will we generally be environmental, will we generally care for nature. And only if we live in a place that also extends over time and in relationships and generations with others will we care about those places. And all of the posturing imaginable will not solve that problem. Berry then is someone, again, who strikingly, again, tends to escape categories or definition, but at least by my definition would constitute someone who looks like a conservative, who seeks to conserve. So let me conclude with just a few remarks, and then I'll end here. Hartz's argument that I began with was written at a time, at a moment in American history, out of a kind of pessimism and resignation, that there was no prospect for socialism in America because of the dominance and indeed the singularity of the liberal tradition in America, in which elites on the left and the right would always rule, and rule always for the advantage of those who would seek the advantage of the strong. And that was perhaps an appropriate condition and conclusion given the strength of that liberal consensus at the time. However, if the reception to my book written in 2018, as was mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, is any indication, liberalism is not in as solid a condition as it was in 1955. And one might lament that, but I think someone like Hartz and someone like myself celebrates that. Not because I seek the demise of liberalism simply for the sake of liberalism, but the possibilities it could open up. I think we are actually in a time when there's perhaps a new openness to different possibilities. And here, I think the possibility perhaps of socialism or of conservatism might be in the offing. And the interesting debate going forward, and this is why I always read Jody Dean, because I had to be ready for this moment. The interesting possibility for this moment is it'll be an argument based on certain empirical aspects. Are the people revolutionary or are they conservative? And if that's the terms of our debate, then we're in for an interesting ride. Thank you very much.
Professor, thank you very much for a really thought-provoking lecture. I thought we'd take a couple of minutes here for some conversation, then kick it out for some questions as well. Let me interrupt your water here. See, the common good, yeah. But no plastic. Let me begin sort of where you left off. As a public intellectual, thank you. You're informing so much of the debate on the new right. J.D. Vance is hugging you at conferences. We read about you. Marco Rubio, the young, dynamic Republican senators are following your work. As I said, your book was heralded by David Brooks and was on President Obama's recommended books to read in 2018. But I noted you gave a lecture at Catholic University when you said this: I don't want to violently overthrow the government. I want something far more revolutionary than that. That caught my attention. I assume you're not talking about January 6th or any of the impact of that. You're talking as a political theorist. Your book after Why Liberalism Failed was on regime change, right? So could we knit those two pieces together and help me through what you want more than a violent overthrow of the government, something much more revolutionary than that?
Maybe the correct word is radical in the original meaning of that word, which means going to the roots. So as you can probably tell, I didn't talk a lot about, I did talk some about liberalism tonight, but I didn't necessarily define it. But I think implicitly a certain definition was there. What a radical remaking of America would be to, in a sense, replace the liberal understanding of human beings. Human beings as Locke describes them as, by nature, free and autonomous human beings that possess individual rights that make them, in a sense, impervious to the calls and demands of the broader society. This is the principle of rights, and hence why the language of rights tends to work whether it's on the left or the right. This is why it's a constant source of frustration on the left that you can't pass gun control laws because this is a right. And this is why it's a constant frustration on the part of the right with issues like abortion, because the right to bodily possession of my body is right there in Locke. It's right there in Book 5 of the second treatise. Right? What is ownership? What is property? It's the ownership of myself. Right? So the language of rights acts as a trump against any kind of broader sense of myself as part of something that's
lowercase t.
Yeah. Yes. Lowercase t. So I'm talking about cards here. So what I mean by a radical redefinition and understanding of America would be one that would in a sense take on the kind of Hart's thesis, which is that we're more than simply our Lockeanism. Yeah. And that's why I say it's overthrowing the government. And let me preface this by saying the following: the title "regime change" obviously was chosen, trying to sell some books. It was with the commercial press. But it was chosen also with some purpose, which is really I was invoking and appealing to the classical definition of the word regime, which means you could say the overarching way of life, how a polity, how a community, how a political order thinks of itself. So that, of course, touches on its laws, it touches on how it arranges its political offices, but it's far more than that. It's how it arranges its social order, how it arranges its economic order, how it thinks of itself, how we as individuals think of ourselves. And so calling for regime change in the sense in which I meant it means far more than overthrowing the government. In fact, I would say that America is very good at overthrowing governments. We're very bad at regime change. We're very good at overthrowing government. It turns out regime change is very hard. We overthrew the Iraq government, we overthrew the Afghani government. That was easy. But changing a regime is actually very hard. And that's what I meant when I said, I'm not interested in just overthrowing it. I'm not really interested in overthrowing the government. If you change the regime, then the government
is in some sense secondary.
And part of this underneath it is your view of the common good conservatism, right? That's the foundational piece that you see as part of this regime change, I suspect, right?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, so the language of common good, of course, means many things to many people. And over that understanding, we could and should and would debate for a long time. But the liberal tradition, I would say in its essence, certainly in this Lockean dimension, begins with the presupposition that there is no such thing as a common good. There's utilitarian good. There's the good of accumulating our various interests and sort of reaching a provisional decision about where the utility lies. But a common good is an appeal to something that's objectively good, that for human beings is objectively good, and that's common, that's shared, that is shared among all human beings. The common good tradition then, and certainly as it goes back to the Aristotelian, the Catholic Thomistic tradition, holds the view that human beings have a nature, and that the realization or the flourishing of our nature requires certain conditions. And we could probably in this room agree on what a lot of that would look like. Certain kinds of material conditions, certain kinds of education, healthcare, and so forth. What I stress in that book is, as I think indicated in the lecture, is the idea of it being common or ordinary. And here was my test as I was thinking about this book and using this phrase, common good. We often think, so in my world, people who study Thomistic philosophy or Aristotelian philosophy will often try to get to what is the big highfalutin idea of the good that we can then say this is what we can all agree to as objectively good. And I wanted to begin really at the kind of the real bottom level. If we look around at the commoners today, the people who are not attending, well, maybe some of you are attending this institution, but not attending Notre Dame, not going to college, probably working service jobs, working trades and so forth, manufacturing jobs. How are they doing? How are they doing? And here, I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump, but I am a huge fan of the reasons that people voted for Donald Trump. I shouldn't say that. That came out wrong. I'm a huge fan of the expression of discontent of those who voted for Donald Trump. In other words, I think we have, or those of us in institutions like this, I'm not saying this institution, but a lot of academic institutions, have essentially given us permission to dismiss those concerns because we focused entirely on Donald Trump. He's a bad man. He tweets mean.
So is that how the left screwed up? Is this Trump deranged?
It's not just the left. Of course, it's the right too. It's right liberals. These are the never Trumpers. Right? This is Bill Kristol and Jonah Goldberg. So this is the classical liberals who want to defend the classical liberal tradition against this more populist tradition. Yes, they despise Trump, but I think at a deeper level they despise the possibility of a populism. So if we ask the question, how are the commoners doing? I think this is why J.D. Vance, among others, is reading me and I'm reading him. They're not doing well. In fact, they're doing terribly in our country. They're doing disgracefully terribly in our country. I mean, we should be ashamed in this country. And in the wake of the Trump election, at least in most of the institutions that I'm aware of, most of the discussion was about the threat to democracy and how authoritarianism was about to take over the country, and very little discussion of the conditions that led to people thinking that he was the best option and what could be done to redress those conditions. And that's where I think a concern with the common good, if we especially focus on commoners, would be the beginning of what I would call a kind of common good conservatism. I'm using the word conservatism in a very different sense than the way people usually mean that.
So one more question before we go out to yours. In a post-Trump Republican Party, because you are, as you said, hip deep in the conservative movement, who is out there that you interact with? You said you're reading Senator Vance. He's talked about you a fair amount. Who else do you see as leading conservative elected officials that animate the conservative movement that we should be aware of?
I don't think I'm going to name anyone that you don't know. But here, I think rather than listing a number of names. I mean, we could, Trump will be in the mix, and maybe Senator Hawley, Senator Rubio, Tom Cotton. These are various stripes of people trying to ride the Trump wave. I think there will be a really interesting kind of question and moment facing the so-called conservative movement. I mean, the conservative movement was formed kind of from the top down by people like William F. Buckley in the 1950s. It's just such an interesting history to read about how, kind of a bunch of Yale grads, kind of confected a political movement, which had a populist element, but was really a kind of in the brains of the time that opposed leftism, invented it, kind of in a laboratory. And what they did was they saw that there was, as many political movements are, there was a common point of opposition that could weld together three different elements that otherwise weren't comfortably fit together. Right? This is what's called fusionism. So you had the economic libertarians, Hayek and Friedman. You had Cold War hawks. So what come to be known as the neocons, used to be on the left but become conservatives under this new dispensation. So the forebears of someone like Bill Kristol. And then you have the social conservatives, especially evangelicals, conservative Catholics, and this will be the coalition. That coalition worked, and it worked more or less through the election, the re-election of Ronald Reagan, and then was already beginning to fray. And it was beginning to fray because the economic policies, especially of the more neoliberal side, were playing havoc with those who were in the more kind of traditionalist social conservative side of things. Right? So this was at the beginnings of the age of outsourcing and moving factories overseas, everything getting shipped to China, and the rise of globalization, which then becomes what today is called neoliberalism, which is spread across both the left and the right, but it begins on the right. And in this condition, the people who are voting over and over for the candidates, thinking that this person will represent me, are finding that their economic and social conditions continuing to deteriorate. And hence why Thomas Frank writes this book. What's the matter with Kansas? Why does Kansas keep voting against its economic interests? So this is all fraying, and nobody noticed. Nobody noticed. There was no candidate. I mean, the one candidate who tried to run on this was Rick Santorum. He was kind of one of the first to see this, and he did reasonably well, but it wasn't quite ripe yet. Nobody really noticed this, in a sense, this market, if we can put it in those terms, until Donald Trump noticed it. And he didn't do it because he did market research. I don't think he's ever read anything, much less written a book. But what he intuited was that there was this kind of political market out there that he could tap into. And this political market, and if you watched his campaign in 2016, it was full of all kinds of incoherence and so forth, but he did sound three themes that were consistent. And the three themes were running, two of which ran directly contrary to the original fusionist movement. One of which was free market economics is out. Right? Tariff, close the borders, we're going to reshore manufacturing, going to protect and build American manufacturing, which really appealed to the Midwest and the upper Midwest, the blue states up there, the blue wall that turned red. Notice in the South Carolina debate in 2016, what did he do? He attacked Jeb Bush for his brother's invasion of Iraq. And this is in one of the most military-rich states in the country. A lot of the military is drawn from states like, soldiers are drawn, but rank and file soldiers are drawn from states like South Carolina. He criticized the Republican invasion of Iraq and said, we have to stop trying to spread democracy at the point of a gun. He said, we need to restrain our foreign policy. We need to pull back. What gets accused of being isolationist, but is actually kind of an old tradition in America. In fact, it's an old populist tradition in America. The upper Midwest was always much more America first. Before Donald Trump used that phrase, it was a phrase up in the upper Midwest, Robert Follett, among others. So it was a phrase that had a long tradition behind it. And then he appealed to the social conservatives. right? Saying that I'm not one of you necessarily, but I will fight for you in ways that others have not. So, I'm sorry, your question, there's a long answer to it. The really interesting thing about your question is that there will be titanic efforts, as there continue to be, to reinstate the old fusion model. And there are candidates who are ready to run. In fact, kind of Chris Christie and some others were running as the reinstatement of the old fusionism. And then there will be new and younger populists that will seek to sort of assume this new fusionism that Trump unearthed. And without Trump on the ballot, the real question is going to be, was it Trump? Or was it actually a change in the conservative movement? And I don't know. I mean, this is where political science is really limited, because I can tell you what the conditions are, but I don't know what the outcome is going to be. And that's what's going to make that interesting. So.
Okay, so we have time for a couple questions here. Let me open the floor to Sophia, right there. I don't know if we have a mic, but I can repeat your question if you. We do have a mic. Give it up for Kristen Tapscott here, everybody.
Thank you. Hello? Okay. So your top two quadrants that you put on the screen reminded me of the work of two sociologists, Robert Bellah and Steve Tipton, who evaluated the counterculture and kind of said it was a revolt against utilitarian individualism in the Lockean sense, and also against technocracy. So I was kind of wondering, it was the two things that kind of governed American life up until that point. So I was wondering, in your kind of populist conservative vision, what would be the governing framework of this life, if not utilitarian individualism or the governing of technocratic elites?
Good question. Yeah, it's a great question. Well, are you referring to their book, Habits of the Heart?
That was, Bella's book was Habits of the Heart,
Yeah, okay. And Tipton was one of the co-authors of that book, yeah. Well, in fact, I think that book, like me, wished that Americans were becoming disillusioned with, much sort of utilitarian, technocratic, individualistic worldview. But in fact, that book sort of saw it as very pervasive at the time. And a lot of books written around that time really begin to sound the alarm bell that this kind of, we could say, this Lockean inflected vision of the human being was never as sort of true, never as fully realized as it is beginning in the 70s and into the 80s. That there was a stronger sense of solidarity, certainly coming out of World War II, and even before then, because it was a much more religious society, where people belonged to congregations and saw themselves as a congregation. I mean, it's hard to believe this, but there were churches out there that formed universities all over the country. This is what they did. They came together as associations and built institutions, and they, sacrificed for the building of those institutions so that future generations could benefit from those institutions. Right? This was the lifeblood of the American system. Of course, this is what Tocqueville sees when he comes to America and says, wow, in France, if there's a pothole, all the French people complain about it and wait for the government to come out and fill the pothole. In America, someone just gets up and fills it. They just do it. What an amazing country. And beginning in the 70s, people like Bellah and Christopher Lasch, in the book that really makes him famous, The Culture of Narcissism, sound the alarm bell that something fundamental seems to be changing, and the sort of American ethos is shifting toward this very individualistic direction. And really, this is the basis of the argument that I make in Why Liberalism Failed, which is essentially the reason this has happened is that we became true to our philosophy. We were never quite true to our philosophy. We were better than our philosophy. But we've become true. We've conformed ourselves to our philosophy. And what contemporary social science data really shows, so people like Robert Putnam, my colleague Christopher Smith at University of Notre Dame, the people who actually work with numbers, unlike me, if you want to look at the part of political science or sociology that actually seems to be showing something that's consistently true, it's that we are becoming more and more isolated, more and more alone, more and more on our own. Right? We're becoming less and less connected, less and less likely to feel ourselves in connection with each other. Like one of the most striking pieces of data that I've seen was in I think it was a National Review. I do occasionally read it, much to my regret. A National Review issue that reported the decline of friendship. And what it reported was not just the decline of friendship, but the decline of number of close friends. So one of the pieces of data that it reported was that 20 years ago, this was maybe 5 years ago this was reported, 5 years ago people could report that they had 5 close friends, really close friends, like the kind of friend you can call up at 3 a.m. and say, my boyfriend just broke up with me and I need to talk to somebody, and they'll get out of bed and come and talk to you. Now if you have 5 of those friends, you can spread out your woes. You don't have to call them, night after night. You drive home from the bar and you have 5 people to choose from. Now it's 1. One person is, at least in this poll, is a very close friend. Is this your close friend? Yeah. So that's good. You know who you're calling tonight. But notice, if it's just one close friend, that's a lot of pressure. So Bella, Lash, people like Robert Putnam, what they're identifying is this, the kind of outworking of this liberal philosophy, I would say. And I think what you're really pointing to is a deep discontent that I think is widespread. I talk to a lot of students, my own, and I go all over the place, and a sense of deep discontent, but no real ability to say what it would take to change it. What it would take to change it. And I think it's probably the task of your generation, because our generation got you into this mess. I just don't know what tools we have to give you, because we've disassembled a lot of them.
Great question. One last question. Nico.
If I misconstrue anything that, like my interpretation of what you said, if you could correct me. It was like something at the beginning that struck me that you talked about was it's hard for the US to have a kind of socialist movement because we never had the feudalist kind of stratification in Europe. I was a little confused by it. How would we explain then racial disparities today in America? I feel like there is, and there was, sort of stratification early on, especially in regards to slavery in America. So just from your perspective, how do we explain disparities today?
Yeah, so, it's a great question. That's actually one of the, you're very good, you get an A for today, because that's actually one of the critiques that Hartz was often criticized for, was not noticing, in a sense, a kind of condition that was not unlike that of feudalism. But I suppose the answer of Hartz, so this isn't my theory per se, but if I were to answer this challenge and imagining how Hartz would challenge, and it seems plausible to me, is that we're not talking about the entire population. Right? We're talking about a minority, and at that time a relatively small minority, and one in which the majority, while not equal, while not economically equal, largely felt itself to be in a condition of comparative prosperity. Certainly compared both to the old world that they or their parents or their grandparents had left behind and previous generations. In other words, through at least the 1970s and into the 80s, and even into the 90s with fluctuation, there was a sense that we're all becoming more prosperous. We're all better off. And this is, of course, not the condition of a feudal serf or a peasant. Right? A feudal serf or a peasant is never better off. It doesn't matter how hard you work. Right? The Lord is still just going to take just about 90% of whatever you make. Right? The greatest moment in cinema history is when King Arthur rides up with his coconuts to the peasants, digging the muck in the fields, and he asks them, where their lord is, and they say, we don't have a lord, we're a syndicalist democracy, socialist, blah, 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 which is pretty Hartzian, actually. But the idea that the serfs were anything but serfs. And it's a great moment because we all recognize how funny it is, a great little piece of political commentary. So I think Hartz's argument is that when the vast majority believe themselves to be living in a society in which everyone is constantly better off, in which there's progress, it's not going to be a revolutionary society. There are going to be elements that are going to be foreclosed from that. Although, if you notice, today's conservatives especially, not conservatives necessarily then, but today's conservatives, I should say today's classical liberals, emphasize especially the Declaration and Lincoln as both the document and the figure that justifies why their view, the view of classical liberalism, is the correct view, because it does not exclude any human being. It was a mistake and wrong for the South to do this, and therefore the system philosophically still works. So I think the argument would be liberalism actually is the corrective to racial injustice of the past and not the cause.
Thank you.
Great question. Well, there are two President's Forums remaining this semester. On the 11th, we'll have a conversation about carbon neutrality. Hobart and William Smith has reached a very exciting environmental standard of being carbon neutral, one of 11 colleges and universities in the country. So we'll have a conversation about the students that put that idea together 10 or so years ago, 14 years ago, and Professor Drennan. That's on the 11th. And then on the 18th, Rob Karofsky, a member of the class of '89, will be back on campus. He is president of UBS, talking about economic issues, the economy. So we invite you then. But let me end with my thanks, Professor, for your work, for your contribution to our civic life and polity in helping us frame these issues in this way. You've certainly enhanced our understandings, both from the historical lens of these ways, and really, I think, allowed all of us to see our current politics in a way that's framed by the past in some ways, but your turn on events and turn on liberalism has really been a wonderful conversation. Join me in thanking Patrick.